Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Oh, thank you for braving the January weather, such as it is, to come and join us for the first Colloquium presentation of 2026. My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR. I recognize many of you. And so before I introduce today's speaker, I have a few basic announcements. And the first thing is that our fire marshal has asked for me to make sure you know that the fire exits are those double doors behind the screen. In an event of any emergency, I'll make sure that screen goes up and we will go out that way. We have a number of events coming up this month. So 2 weeks from today, same time, same place. I always want to say same bat channel, same bat. We have our next colloquium, and that will be Professor Zanetta Thayer, right here in the third row, speaking about how evolution shapes our reproductive experience. So please come back in 2 weeks for that talk. Before then, January 20th, we have a virtual event, a webinar, Making Sound Among the Ancestral Maya, with Professor Stephen Houston, who many of you heard speak this fall. Stephen was a one-semester-long fellow. He had to return to Brown University this term, but he'll be joining us remotely for that webinar, Making Sound Among the Ancestral Maya. You can go on our website calendar, and SAR calendar, and you can register there. So please do register if you're interested in that talk. Tuesday, January 20th at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. It's a free thing, a free event on Zoom. And then we also have a series of lectures starting up that we are co-sponsoring about Edgar Lee Hewitt, one of the great founders of SAR and of other institutions here in New Mexico. And the series on Hewitt will be a series of 4 programs. You can again find more detail on our website. The first one, though, January 27th from 4 to 5:30, Edgar Lee Hewitt, Virginia McClurg, and the Politics of Preservation in the American Southwest, a talk by James E. Sneed, professor of anthropology at CSU Northridge. And then another February 24th, March 24th, April 21st, basically one a month for all winter and spring. So I will probably re-announce those later on in this series. But so those are the 3 that I wanted you to be aware of today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Angela K. Parker, who is an associate professor of history at DU, University of Denver. I guess is the official name, but why does everyone say DU instead of University of Denver? Angela's degrees, her PhD is in Native American history from the University of Michigan, her BA from Stanford University in history, and her first book, Damming the Reservation, Tribal Sovereignty and Activism at Fort Berthold, University of Oklahoma Press, published in 2024. So today we'll hear about the project she's been working on here at SAR. So please join me in welcoming Angela Parker.
Hi everyone, and I'm a little bit shorter. Thank you so much to SAR, to Morris, Paul, Erica, and of course to my fellow cohort members who have made this such a generative and amazing place to make significant progress on my next project. Oil is, of course, as we all know, one of the defining forces of the 20th century. It's also one of the most defining forces of our present. Because the products we derive from it seem omnipresent and the resource itself is so fungible, it's easy to devolve into its abstraction as a global commodity. But every global oil story begins somewhere specific, on specific lands, in particular communities, and through negotiations that are anything but theoretical. In the United States, indigenous lands have been central, not peripheral, to the making of modern energy regimes. Oil extraction repeatedly depended on native territories, native resources, and native political systems. Even as wildcatters, multinationals, and the state itself treated those systems as obstacles, technicalities, or administrative inconveniences. My project asks, what happens when we take those local scenes seriously? Not as colorful and tragic backdrop to a global story, but as places where the political life of oil coalesces. The cases I'll discuss today are small in scale: meetings, leases, disputes, moments of breakdown. But these scenes, grounded in moments from the archive, provide data to answer much larger questions about authority, governance, and the pressures extraction places on political life itself. The talk draws from a larger project I call Petrosovereignty that examines indigenous oil politics and activism in the 20th century, and particularly indigenous governance in the context of resource extraction. But today I'm thinking through this problem from inside the archive. First, on the Southern Plains and Indian Territory, amongst the Osage and the Creek, and finally on the Northern Plains, amongst the Crow. Before I take you to allotment statutes or oil leases, I want to open with a different kind of evidence, a song. This Osage corn song isn't cultural background or atmosphere, but a form of political knowledge. It reveals a theory of land that begins from relationship and responsibility, rather than from European notions of property. I found this song in John Joseph Matthews' tome, The Osages, and this is how he describes it, quote, "Her song as she planted, beating the rhythm with her feet and the planting stick, was one of the most beautiful of all the many songs of the little ones," or the Osage. I have made a footprint, a sacred one. I've made a footprint. Through it, the blades must push upward. I've made a footprint. Through it, the blades radiate. I've made a footprint. Over it, the blades float in the wind. I've made a footprint. Over it, the ears lean towards each other. I've made a footprint. Over it, I pluck the ears. I've made a footprint. Over it, I bend the stalks to pluck the ears. I have made a footprint. Over it, the tassels lie gray. I have made a footprint. Smoke rises from my lodge. I have made a footprint. There's cheer in my lodge. I've made a footprint. I live in the light of day. The repetition here matters. The footprint is not simply a mark on land, a title deed or extraction. It's an act that sustains growth and claims relationship. The footprint is sacred, yes, but it is also practical. It produces food. It produces a cycle. Land is where sustenance becomes social life, where work becomes kinship, where cultivation becomes responsibility. The blades push upwards. The ears lean towards each other. The tassels lie gray. Smoke rises from my lodge. This is land understood through time, seasonality, care, and home. So even before we get to law or policy or Congress, we can already see what is at stake here historically. This song is a reminder that the political world I'm describing today begins from a place where land is already meaningful, already governed, already embedded in daily life, long before federal frameworks enter the story. This is what it means to begin with land as relationship, a footprint that obligates life. I want to pause here to be clear by what I mean by land in this talk, because land is not a backdrop. In the Osage corn song, land is relationship and obligation, a sacred footprint, yes, but also a practical one. But land becomes jurisdiction. Territory is what makes sovereignty real. It is where law has force, where a community has the right to make rules. And then under allotment, land is remade as property, individualized, transactable, and legible to the state. Once oil arrives, land is no longer just property. It becomes a resource. It becomes a store of value, a site of urgency, a reason to force decisions. And finally, land becomes archival. It becomes paperwork, leases, deeds, registries, minutes. Authority doesn't just get exercised, it gets documented. So when I say that land is being remade into a political object, this is what I mean. This entire transformation, relationship to property to resource. I also want to pause to talk about governance. And in this talk, it's not just the concept of sovereignty. Governance is a daily act of rulemaking, of who gets to speak, how decisions are made, how authority is recognized, and what counts as legitimate. That's why archives are so revealing. Governance shows up in the mundane: lease terms, procedural minutes, agency memos, arrests, paperwork that tells you who is allowed to decide. A key claim I'm making today is that extraction doesn't simply operate against governance, it requires governance to function in certain ways. Extraction needs authority to be legible. It needs enforceable decisions. It needs the appearance of consensus or the appearance of inevitability, which is why moments where that procedural machinery breaks down, sometimes in laughter, ridicule, or refusal, are so politically important. My talk comes out of a larger project about Indigenous oil politics and activism across the 20th century. It's a book about governance, about what happens when Indigenous political systems, what happens to Indigenous political systems when extraction becomes the organizing logic of modern life. I'm not going to give you the entire sweep today. I'm going to stay very close to the archive, and I'm going to take you through three scenes drawn from my first two chapters at Osage, Creek, and Crow, because those scenes let us see governance at the exact moments it's pressured, reshaped, and sometimes broken. So, context. On the Southern Plains, allotment and oil did not simply rearrange ownership. They remade land into a new political object, and they remade Indigenous authority into something that the state could manage, police, and exploit. In Indian country and across the Southern Plains, allotment and oil arrived as a linked political transformation. So we tend to think of these as separate stories, but they're actually completely connected. By the time allotment arrives, the Southern Plains was already politically volatile. Throughout the 19th century, removal, war fractures, epidemic disease, and escalating pressure to convert Indigenous territory into settler property had already upended Osage and Creek worlds. So allotment and oil didn't enter a stable world, but one already under strain. However, allotment made that conversion enforceable. It changed land tenure, and in doing so, it reorganized political authority. Sovereignty rests on territory and resources, on citizenry, and on the authority to govern. And allotment attacked all three by breaking land into property, by redefining political membership, and by shifting authority away from indigenous collective governance. After years of effective resistance by the 5 civilized tribes, which includes the Creek, of course, Congress and the executive mobilized congressional plenary power to enforce the Curtis Act, which dissolved the governments of the 5 tribes and enforced allotment despite their protests. The Osage also battled allotment, and Native political actors like Chief James Bigheart, who you can see up there in the top left. And just a side note, he was a full-blood Osage leader who was educated at the local Osage Catholic mission. He also fought in the Union Army for 3 years during the Civil War. And he spoke several languages, including Osage, English, Cherokee, Muskogee, Lakota, Ponca, French, and Latin. So Osage leaders like Bigheart recognized allotment as a project of conversion. They recognized it for what it was, and they didn't treat it as inevitable, even when it was deeply coercive. So when Congress moved to allot for the Osage leaders, because the Dawes Allotment Act set out like the big policy, right? But each reservation had to go through its own allotment act to, basically force tribes to divide up the land and to allot them out to tribal members. So when Congress began considering a specific allotment act for the Osage, leaders like James Bigheart negotiated aggressively. And one of the most significant outcomes from that negotiation was the separation of surface land from subsurface minerals for the Osage. A repeated and sometimes mythologized phrase states that the Osage might lose the top 15 inches, but they retained what lay beneath. Osage leaders understood that the real struggle was not simply how much land, but what land would be allowed to be. They attempted to hold on to a definition of land in which minerals and the future of their community remained a collective political resource held through what we now know as head rights. So I want to pause here because it's easy to romanticize this as strategic genius, or on the flip side, to treat it as a lucky break. But what I want you to see is that Bigheart and Osage leaders are not simply negotiating policy details. They're fighting over what land will be allowed to be. Allotment tries to remake land into individualized property. And with that, it tries to move governance out of collective authority and into federal legibility. The head right structure is a refusal of that full conversion. It's an attempt to keep the subsurface wealth as a collective political resource, as something attached to futurity, to community membership, to governance. Which means that this isn't just legal history, it's political theory happening in statute form. So once oil arrives, it's not just an industry, it's an accelerant. In Osage country, you go from about 30 wells, I think in 1903, to 783 wells 3 years later. That scale matters because it means you're not just talking about wealth. You're talking about sudden, seemingly overwhelming transformation. Oil also brings demographic change. It brings people with expectations. It brings people seeking wealth and personal benefit. It brings speculation and predation. It brings an entire service economy designed to siphon money away from native households. It also brings governance pressure because oil requires enforceable decisions. It requires leases. It requires titles. It requires adjudication, guardianship rulings, courts, paperwork. So extraction isn't solely an economic event, it's an administrative one. It creates new forms of authority by making land legible and by making indigenous decision-making vulnerable to manipulation. Crucially, it brings a patriarchal white supremacist structure that presents itself as management. The idea that native wealth has to be supervised, that native political judgment is unreliable or incompetent. That's not incidental, that's infrastructure. Big Heart's protective design became, unfortunately, a means of predation. And this is the part of the story that most non-Osage people know. The Osage oil boom generated enormous wealth, transformative wealth. These weren't marginal royalties, but life-altering distributions that made Osage land and peoples a magnet for outsiders, speculation, and coercion. Oil doesn't just bring money, it brings outsiders who, as I said before, require those enforceable decisions. It brings legal mechanisms, pressure on governance, and of course it pushes land from property into resource and radically transforms authority. The murders of Anna Brown, George Bigheart, Henry Rowan, and the 24 to 60 to potentially hundreds of other Osages who were murdered or went missing in the 1920s, they're not simply crime. They're a form of extraction governance, ways of transferring wealth by exploiting the structures that made native property legible to the state. They're a technology for transferring wealth, not just through violence, but through systems like guardianship, incompetency designations, coerced marriage, and administrative control. This governance crisis evolves because the stakes are so high, and procedural law becomes a weapon in that context. So this is the dark underside of the top 15 inches. The protective design is still operating, but it's operating inside a settler system built to convert native life into transferable value. And I want to emphasize that word built, because these are actions. They don't simply happen, right? This isn't simply like an evolution, ungoverned by anyone. These are specific decisions that are being made every step of the way. And this is what it looks like when a footprint becomes a deed, and the deed becomes an opportunity for dispossession. I want now to braid in Creek history. The Muskogee experienced many of the same dynamics under oil extraction as did the Osage, the same sort of predation, the same sort of undermining of Creek political life. But in the Creek example, the storm took a different shape due in equal parts to their specific historical trajectory, their pre-existing political structures, and their negotiation of allotment. In Creek country, allotment arrived in a nation already pressured and rebuilding from removal, and pressured by internal political fracture that had lasted almost the entirety of the 19th century. After the Civil War, Creek governance was fully shaped by a factional conflict over what the nation should become. And part of that conflict was whether collective landholding would survive. Federal allotment policy exploited those fractures. So here, as in Osage country, the struggle over land tenure became a struggle over political authority itself. Creek traditionalists led the battle against allotment, following a long line of Creek political leaders who sought to reestablish traditional Creek political and social norms throughout that maelstrom of the 19th century. By the early 1900s, a leader named Chito Harjo, or Crazy Snake, helped mobilize resistance to allotment. And just as important, he helped mobilize a defense of indigenous collective authority rooted in land, community obligations, and the right to govern. Harjo's followers came to be labeled crazy snakes, a name that in English marks them as irrational, disorderly, and perhaps dangerous. However, the English translation skews Muskogee language, in which Harjo, which is is translated as crazy, Harjo doesn't actually translate to insane, but it translates to the notion of a bravery beyond discretion, a sort of reckless courage. This photograph shows a group of Creek fighters associated with Chito Harjo, or Crazy Snake, and they became known as the Crazy Snakes after their arrest by U.S. forces. And I'd like to suggest that this is a photograph about governance and authority. There are at least three things happening in this image. First of all, it's a state archive of discipline. It documents the criminalization of refusal. Second, it's an image about legitimacy. Allotment requires someone to decide which political order counts, which leaders count, which decisions count. The third thing it shows us that I want to talk about today is that the reorganization of land is inseparable from the reorganization of authority. Because converting territory into property isn't just paperwork, it's coercion, it's enforcement, it's policing. And the reason oil matters is because the stakes of the land conversion are not hypothetical. When bad land becomes oil land, the state has the reason, it develops a reason to insist in the sort of violent use of its power. So there's also, aside from those three main sort of threads, there's an irony that is embedded in this image. People who were recalcitrant or resistant were often pushed in the allotment process to what officials framed as the quote-unquote worst land, undesirable acreage. But in eastern Oklahoma, the supposed worst land became oil land. So some of the richest oil reserves emerged from under the allotments assigned to the people who had actually refused them, so including some of these people. Which meant that during the oil boom, a number of these families became extraordinarily wealthy, including figures like Jackson Barnett, the so-called richest Indian in the world. But I want to come back to the deeper point of the photograph, which is that the federal government is deciding and enforcing which governance will count. And the photograph itself is a data point in the reorganization of a political order. When the federal government turned collective territory into individualized property, it also imposed a jurisdictional revolution, a transfer of authority over land, over rulemaking, and community life. And that's why the crazy snakes in this photograph were seen as so threatening. Because conversion requires enforcement, and it requires a monopoly over legitimacy. It requires the power to declare one political order lawful and another disorderly. The arrest documented in this photograph matters because beyond the punishment of these individuals, it shows the criminalization of collective governance, precisely at the moment when land regimes are being reorganized. The photograph illustrates a crisis and a silencing of governance, a violent assertion. So we're moving north now to the Crow Nation and into the final portion of my talk. The Crow Nation in Montana is, of course, a completely different political landscape, a different set of legal arrangements, and in some ways, a smaller oil story. Crow will never see the vast wealth that flowed through Creek and Osage communities. But the events at Crow are not smaller in terms of the stakes of governance. And importantly, we are actually going to remain in the same era. In the same decades when Osage families labored to survive the predation and violence of the oil boom, that's the same decade from which this scene from Crow emerges. Many times historians narrate these scenes as separate regional stories, but they are in fact unfolding at the same time. And so we're seeing a certain resonance in terms of what are the federal strategies, but also in terms of how tribal communities are communicating with each other to address this new possibility or this new incursion in their communities. At Crow, part of the context that you need to know is that a young Crow politician named Robert Yellowtail has already visited the Osage to understand the impact of their vast oil wealth. And you also need to know that for decades, Crow leadership has pushed for greater control over leasing agreements, but the sort of conflict that they had with the Indian office was over things like grazing rights, not necessarily oil. Archival documents show that Crow leaders and community members position oil leases alongside other self-determination concerns. So they position it alongside water rights, alongside land use, and invariably, in most of those cases, their local Indian agent, Calvin Asbury, has been fairly high-handed on all of these issues. So that's the setup you need to know. Okay, and I just also want to say that I love government archives because more often than you would expect, they give us very official and procedural summaries of Native communities and individuals and activists who just refuse to comply with their plans. The meeting documented by Crow Superintendent Calvin Asbury focused on the oil leases that he had approved and that were pretty much universally panned by the Crow community. And there were different operators from the ones that had been approved by Asbury who were actually at this meeting offering more favorable terms. Okay, but more so than the specific lease content, I'm fascinated in this sort of write-up by how we can see governance operating. So throughout the write-up, and I mean, Asbury, he would like type up reams of papers that he submitted to the central office, the Central Office of Indian Affairs, basically just complaining about how recalcitrant the Crow were. So it's really entertaining. But so in this write-up, Asbury's own narrative reveals how he completely failed to maintain his authority or even his dignity. As he and other non-natives talk, women laugh, people interrupt, ridicule circulates, and there are always these long interpretive speeches made in Crow after the white people talk. The procedural script necessary to maintain federal power or to entice the community to agree to a different lease agreement completely fails. As you can see from the portion that I highlighted, Asbury himself wrote, quote, "The Indian women showed more animus than the men, and by applause, laughter, or ridicule, let their attitude be known as each speaker proceeded." So it's a fairly unique moment that reveals the way that gender was operating within Crow governance. And what becomes visible is something that we don't always see if we don't examine the community level, right? If we keep oil as this global story. Extractive projects require governance to perform in certain ways. They require meetings to produce enforceable decisions. They require authority to be legible and to hold. So this is why governance is not, a background to extraction. The terms of governance serve as part of the necessary infrastructure of extraction. And in this room, the infrastructure failed. The scene reveals that extraction governance, and especially federal extraction governance, is in fact brittle. It depends on authority being recognized. It depends on tempo. It depends on intimidation. It depends on procedural smoothness. So I'm fascinated by this scene because it illustrates a form of indigenous political disruption that doesn't fit our usual categories of resistance. It's laughter as political judgment, ridicule as the refusal of inevitability. I want to end by naming the logics that connect these scenes. Oil depends on flow. It moves across markets, across borders, across institutions. It converts land into capital quickly, and that speed is part of its power. It also depends on abstraction. Ownership becomes detached from place and from people. Value becomes deterritorialized. And then, and this is a paradox, it always has to be re-territorialized through violence, through law, force, and procedure. That's where urgency comes from, this idea we must act now, there's no time to deliberate, this is inevitable. These logics that benefit extraction collapse deliberation, and they justify coercion. They turn political disagreement into emergency action. But the archive shows something else. These arrangements aren't natural. They're made. They require constant enforcement, which means that they're fragile and contestable. This is another way of saying that these dynamics are malleable. They've been made, and they can be unmade. Thank you.
So we have some time for Q&A. Okay, thank you. I wanted to say I forgot to announce that you were the Katrin Lamon Fellow this year, and it's a so important thing to do, and I felt like an idiot. What an amazing talk. If I can take the first question since I have the mic. There's so many, it's so rich, I think this was one of the most beautiful talks I've ever heard. So thank you. And it's certainly relevant to what we're seeing right now in the link between governance and extraction in Venezuela, for example, in this 100%. Sort of crisis moment. Mm-hmm. I had a question though, and this may be a little bit unfair to what you're really looking at, but your talk right away made me think about Timothy Mitchell's work, Carbon Democracy. And for those who are not familiar with this work, it was an argument that the form of carbon extraction matters in terms of governance. In other words, he looks at the transition from coal, and he argued that coal miners were able to organize to generate more democratic forms of government. It's in the era of coal, and then when extraction, the form of carbon switches to oil, it's much harder to kind of, for working people to maintain that kind of edge. And I'm just curious whether there's anything, as you've studied oil in these different contexts, in these specific contexts, do you see ways in which you might want to kind of speak back to that sort of carbon democracy thesis, or does it seem to make sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense to me, and I love that book. And there's also another really great work by Myrna Santiago about oil extraction in Veracruz. And she already has done, I feel like, the work to show how oil extraction in particular is this sort of blanket force that really remakes political authority within a territory, right? So it makes a lot of sense to me. And what I'm hoping that my project adds to that is that, I mean, so Santiago and Carbon Democracy are really focused on like labor and labor history. And Native people are working in oil fields generally, but they're in not as, you know, sort of like direct of an extractive role, right? Like they're the leaseholders. Mm-hmm. And so what I hope that this work sort of is able to contribute is that the resistance or the remaking of terms doesn't just happen within the field of labor, but it happens through this relationship to land, right? Because, you know, many times the laborers are not property owners, right? And specifically because Native communities have such a deep and sort of specific political understanding of the landscape itself and what resources mean and what they want resources mean to their future. That's kind of what I'm hoping on. So I guess I would say I'm building on that more than relitigating it, if that makes sense.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Questions? I'll go in the order I see your hands go up.
Thanks. Hi, thank you. And I'm wondering if you've come across in your research and everything, the doctrine of discovery is still, you know, it's part of our legal system in this country, and it's been used at the Supreme Court in the 2000s. Did it play a big role in some of these manipulations or decisions legally?
I mean, I think when we think about the doctrine of discovery, and specifically we think about the Marshall Trilogy itself, right, and how you know, Marshall was mobilizing the doctrine of discovery. Those three cases in particular are important and fascinating and frustrating because you begin to see this sort of legal rationale being completely made up and fabricated, right? And so he's doing his best, right, to lead people through a sort of legal rationale for why the federal government has certain power with regard to indigenous land. But I would say, like, after Marshall, when you look at, you know, other like key court cases that are deciding jurisdiction or deciding like land use, resource use, et cetera, a lot of them use the same sort of sleight of hand that he was using in terms of relying on the doctrine of discovery. They're not supporting it. They're just treating it as though it is, in fact, you know, good law and good precedent, et cetera. And so I don't know if anyone really uses it. I mean, it's a reference, right? But that's different from interrogating, you know, shoring up, you know, sort of justifying it, right? And so doctrine of discovery remains one of these, I guess I would call it like under thought or under analyzed or under theorized components of federal power, like more generally. So yes, people are using it. I think they're generally across history since the Marshall Trilogy using it in a really crude and sort of unsophisticated way. And so then it sort of like begs a question, like, are you really mobilizing it, or is this just part of like your citations that you're using to say, yeah, and this part too? I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of what's coming up as I'm thinking about it.
Got a question over here.
Kind of a two-part question, a more general one with a subpart. I was wondering if you've given any thought to how your conceptual formulation applies in a more universal respect to resource extraction. And under that, specifically, I personally have been thinking a lot about water rights and the Colorado River and indigenous voices and participation in decision-making. And so I'm wondering if you see any connection between your framework and water.
Well, I think oil and water are really linked, and for the purposes of finishing this book, I chose to perhaps over-focus on water or on oil, right? So I think it does have a lot of application when we think about water as a resource that flows, that, you know, must be used. What happens when it is less available? What happens when it's, you know, sort of, you know, going through the process of capture, right? So I think there are definitely huge and strong connections there. In terms of like a universal application, historians hate universals. Like, we're so nerdily focused on our specific forms of history, right? And so, like, you almost got treated to like an hour and a half long talk that did a deep dive into 19th century Osage and Creek history, which I'm sure you're very happy that I cut that part out. But, you know, a lot of times for historians, like, that historical context is so crucial, and it becomes like the determining factor in understanding the moment that we're trying to interrogate, right? And so I think just as a discipline, historians really shy away from universals, because when we look at, you know, Venezuela, when we look at Guatemala, when we look at these other places, they have such a different historical trajectories, right? They have totally different land laws. They have totally different moments of sort of like indigenous dispossession, right, within their land tenure systems. And yeah, so I think like as a discipline, we tend to, you know, shy away from that. But it's also perhaps why we're not read as much as anthropologists. Because there are connections, and because there are resonances, right? And especially when we're thinking about the history of oil, and we're thinking about these multinationals that are actually, you know, explicitly repeating techniques of sort of like interruption of governance and interruption of land regimes, like that type of thing. They are in fact connected, right? There are definite connections and definite, you know, sort of like global resonances. So I don't know if this project will go there, but what I'm hoping is that this project will be read not just by historians, but also by anthropologists and by political scientists and, like a wider audience that will force them to interrogate this framing that always has oil as a global phenomenon and loses the fact that, the ground level resistance or the ground level sort of interrogations that are happening are so instructive for showing us where this huge power structure is most brittle.
Questions?
There's a beat underneath all of this, which is, and you keep using it, money and wealth. And I don't know what, it seemed to me that one of the requirements and one of the results of all of this is that there needed to be a drastic change forced internally and externally on these indigenous communities as to what those two terms meant. And that this was a major dynamic in affecting these governance changes. What do you think of that?
I think that's true. I think when you think about money and wealth, right, that's also an integral part of like these political systems. And I'm so thankful to SAR because it gives me time and space. So as I initially thought about this project, there was the book that I referenced by John Joseph Matthews, The Osages. And, in the midst of teaching and commuting and being on the bus and trying to get like work done and, all these types of things, I saw the page count for The Osages, which is almost like 800 pages. And I was like, nah, I'm not going to read that. I'll just read the more current like scholarship. I'll read the more, the things that have been published most recently, right? And so as I was browsing in the SAR library, I saw it and I was like, I'll check it out. And, maybe some of the descriptions I can use for like local color. Like it was very extractive, the way that I was going to be using Matthews's work. And then as I started reading, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. This is really good. Because he had done like 30, maybe upwards of 30 interviews with tribal elders who were alive before the reservation era, right? And you see it over and over, like the corn song, right? That came from the interviews that he did. And so it was written in or is published in 1954, which is typically like before when, I want to read anything about Native people, just because it can be so offensive sometimes. What he talks about in this transition, you can see like these clear data points, not just in terms of, the idea of collective ownership of land or collective governance, but also that idea of what constitutes wealth, right? And so, he talks about how there was this certain point that he's writing about in the 1700s and early 1800s when wealth is defined within the Osages as generosity, right? And the ability to be generous, right, to other community members. And that, it was something that if you wanted to hold political power within Osage communities, you had to be ready to be generous, like every day. There was never a point at which you could refuse someone food or say, I'm taking a personal health day, right? Like you just had to show up. Like that was a requirement, right? And so you see this definition of wealth change through the trajectory of the story that he tells. And I would say if you have the chance to read it, you should read it because it's amazing, beautiful, and it's such a gift that he was able to preserve those interviews and the work that he had done with those elders for future generations. And it's very readable too, because he's actually also like a fiction writer, right? So it's not like a dry historical tome by any means. Oh, yeah, The Osages. It's by John Joseph Matthews, and it's Mathews. So there's no double T. And so that's definitely part of the story, right? It's part of this trajectory of what is forced to change in order to exert power, right? And I think that's also, what we see as, like, in these sort of like ground level scenes. That's the moment where the power structure becomes weakest, because literally what you see across the 20th century in the federal archives are tribal communities refusing that notion of wealth, right? So there might be an acquiescence to allotment at a certain point, right? As it's shoved down people's throats. People will say, okay, I will go and build a home here, and this will be my land, right? But what doesn't really change, and this is also deeply tied to kinship, right? And to how we understand our relatives and what our obligations are to our relatives. But that notion of what constitutes wealth, what the importance of generosity in maintaining kinship ties, and sort of the social labor that goes into maintaining like this sense of self and identity as indigenous peoples, that doesn't change. And so that's actually like a really, I think, crucial point to sort of recognize and think through. Like, it's a fulcrum of resistance, right? And when we give up that sense of I am going to become a good little capitalist and accrue capital and save it all for myself, and I'm never going to care about like the people who might be suffering down the street, right? That might be the moment, right? More so than loss of language or loss of like living specifically on the reservation, where identities become most distant, right, from like an indigenous identity. I don't know. That seems like a universal. I'm not comfortable with that.
Well, maybe that's a great spot to say that's enough for today. And thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Parker.